Hi again. Um, so we're pursuing our narrative, and today's lecture. Oh, incidentally, is there anything left over from last time? Anything you want to bring up? Okay. Um, I'm just making sure that everybody can get in. Okay. So we stopped at the last time with essentially Johnson throwing in the towel, capitulating, giving up the presidency, and calling for negotiations and saying the United States would cease bombing in the area of Hanoi, a partial halt to Operation Thunderbird. At the same time, he did fulfill Westmoreland's call for more troops, in the sense that he sent a token further 13,000, but the call for over 200,000 new troops was rejected. And all of this was greeted with jubilation in the United States. It meant that Johnson was backing off, that negotiations were beginning, and that sooner or later the war would, especially the war which involved casualties on the part of the Americans, would stop. And this proved to be true. At the same time, it is also true that with diminishing American ground participation, with the gradual Vietnamization of the ground war, and that's the essence of it, getting out of the combat on the ground. Forget about the air war. I mean, that didn't involve significant American casualties. Without the American presence, the question was, could the ARVN and could the two government, the Republic of Vietnam's government, survive? And in the longest term, if you're going to pull out on the ground, in the final analysis, the Republic of Vietnam was not viable. It was not self-sustaining, as of course events proved to be the case. Now, in any case, talks began in Paris on May the 12th, 1968, and they proved long drawn out, in fact, 5 years of negotiations in Paris, sometimes public, more often in secret, went on. And what we have is a situation of a combination of negotiations, sometimes intense and sometimes seeming to go nowhere, while the fighting continued. It was making war and negotiating, negotiation and conflict at the same time. Now, from the very beginning, it was very difficult because the North Vietnamese, the DRV, basically said the Americans presence is illegal according to the Geneva Agreement. They have invaded Vietnam and they should leave. That was the basic demand of the DRV. And the American side basically said, we are defending a legitimate state. The DRV is a foreign aggressor, and it should withdraw its troops from South Vietnam. And so there were these conflicting interpretations. Personally, it's clear that the American interpretation was untenable because clearly in violation of the Geneva Agreement. In any case, basically the Americans were opening negotiations, but they still believed that they could, in the final analysis, they could still achieve their goal of consolidating a non-communist state in South Vietnam, Republic of Vietnam. This was the bottom line for the Americans. And Johnson certainly felt that way even after he made the speech. His fundamental belief was that that should be the basic American goal. And in fact, he went to his grave. He died 5 years after he resigned in 1973. And basically, I think he died of heartbreak. The whole thing just, he died a deeply disappointed individual. His career was totally collapsed as a result, and he died of chagrin, really. But it's notable that the new president eventually, and we'll get there, Richard Nixon, believed basically the same thing, that one way or another, and I say this deliberately, by hook or by crook, it would be possible to maintain an independent Vietnam. He did oversee the withdrawal of American troops, but he felt that if he built up the ARVN military machine and he made a deal, and eventually there was a deal with China, it would be possible to maintain a South Vietnamese state, especially because the Americans continued the air war, continued the air support until the end. So, but of course, that also turned out to be true, untrue. Well, why did I say by hook or by crook when I was referring to Nixon? Can anybody explain that?
I actually have a question.
Yes.
Why was Paris selected for the negotiations between the North and South? Because it seems like a very biased location. Like it's France. It's, they were just at war with North Vietnam. Like, why wasn't a neutral party selected?
I think it was it's a good question to which I do not have we'll have to go back into the actual circumstances between March and May to get the answer to this, and I can't give it to you. I think the answer may be that, of course, the French had lost the first war, and they were certainly both the extreme left and the extreme right were hostile to the United States. De Gaulle, when I talked about this, the run on the dollar in '68, it was the French under de Gaulle who had set off this. De Gaulle perniciously began to dump began to dump dollars to sort of undermine the American position. After de Gaulle left, other more moderate right-wing politicians took power, and France, from this point onward, was seeking rapprochement with the United States. They began to sort of moderate the sort of Gaullist nationalism which had characterized French politics up until then, and they began to come closer. Also, I think that the war in Vietnam, you have to understand, was an international war in the sense that the whole world was watching this war. The whole world, and I'll mention in a few minutes, was caught up in 1968. That's people were obsessed all over the world with the war in Vietnam. They were outraged by the war, or they were wringing their hands about the destruction that was going on in Vietnam. So the French, in a way, offered their good offices. It made them look good. And so I think those are some of the explanations. But I think you'd have to go back and sort of look carefully about the diplomacy. And I just don't know. I can't say in a definitive way why. Any other questions people have? Okay. The basic, from a strategic point of view, the American move to basically wind down this commitment, to begin to wind down what we call Vietnamization, it came from the conclusion of the wise men that the United States was overcommitted, that it had worldwide interests, and it needed to ensure those. And Vietnam was just sucking America dry. So better to sort of, if you can't completely dominate and win over the situation, limit your goals, limit your losses, cut your losses, and move on, because the stakes are global. And having said all that, I would note that the United States has recently done the same thing in another country. Can anybody name that country?
Afghanistan?
Exactly. Their withdrawal from Afghanistan, their sudden withdrawal from Afghanistan is basically a follow-up to what they did in Vietnam. Their global interests were more important than suppressing the insurgency in Afghanistan. And especially what, of course, what the United States is concerned with is, of course, the same old problem, containment of China. And so the reason that they withdrew from Afghanistan is that they want to redeploy to East Asia to deal with China. And so this is what explains it. Now, but what should, I'm still continuing on this line, what one should understand is that it does have a certain significance, the fact that the Americans have withdrawn from Afghanistan, because 20 years ago, we're now in 2021, but 20 years ago, the Americans were, you weren't around at that time, but the Americans were absolutely triumphant. They had triumphed over the Soviet Union. They had defeated, it looked like communism was over. There was no other power that could rival. China was still way back. It looked like this was America's moment, the unilateral moment. And there were many sort of intellectuals and ideologues in the United States basically said that the United States is now a world empire. We're just like Rome. And the rest of the world is dependent on us, and we can basically do whatever we want. And Well, they did. They invaded in order to sort of secure themselves in the Middle East. They invaded both Iraq and Afghanistan. Um, and so what I would say is the pullout from Afghanistan signifies that this mistaken belief that they were the new Roman Empire, that fantasy is over. And that's significant from a geopolitical point of view. The idea that the United States has or can conquer the world, the people in Washington have sort of given up that illusion. And so that's a significant development internationally. In any case, this is what began to happen in Vietnam. The Americans were ultimately pulling away. Now, another thing that comes up, and this goes back to this notion of revisionism. I said that the people on the extreme right, especially militarily minded people, or certain Hollywood characters, think the Americans could have won the war in Vietnam if they had been more stalwart and, in fact, invaded North Vietnam, for example. But in any case, they thought that the Tet Offensive was a victory and so on. And what they said was, one of the things they said was, it was the damn press. The press, they're the ones, the television and print reporters, they undermined the American war effort. They were so critical and so on that they were the ones who, being able to shape American public opinion, basically made it possible for the peaceniks or the doves to win out in the battle of ideas. And so it was the press that was responsible. Well, in response to that, it has been said, and it has been analyzed, that in fact, if you look at the press overall and the TV, et cetera, all the media, that until the Tet Offensive, the press was overwhelmingly on the side of the hawks. Pursue the war, win the war. That was the theme in the American press. What was true was that certain media, like the New York Times, which is of course very influential, and others, were critical of the way the war was being conducted. They criticized the corruption. They criticized the incompetence in the conduct of the war, but they didn't, in principle, object to the war itself. It was only after Tet that the press began to say, this has been basically a mistake, and we got to get out. We have to get out. It was only then. As a matter of fact, the triumph of the anti-war side came basically as a result of the activities of the peace movement from the grassroots, from the universities, from the colleges, from the cities. This grassroots agitation developed, and it became more and more powerful, and of course was reinforced by the growing social disturbance within American society. And so the triumph of the peaceniks was from the grassroots, is what I would say. Now, meanwhile, to come back to the Paris peace talks, it was a stalemate. As I said, both sides reiterated their positions, which I've given you. The DRV basically said that in particular, more substantially, that the Americans as a testimony of their good faith that they should completely stop bombing North Vietnam, that the they played, the DRV played to the American public opinion. They tried to reinforce the peace movement within the United States, which you'd sort of expect. In this regard, of course, the famous movie star Jane Fonda played a big role. She was she went to Hanoi in the middle of the conflict and basically took the side of the Republic of Vietnam, met all the leaders, posed in various places, and was christened by the Hawks as Hanoi Jane. Hanoi Jane. It took her a long time to get back into the graces of certain elements in American public opinion, because she was an outstanding peacenik during this period. In the meantime, in terms of the fighting, 1968 was the year of maximum conflict, especially conflict involving the United States on the ground. Remember the plan of Westmoreland? There was going to be stabilization and buildup, and then there would be seek out and destroy, search and destroy. Well, search and destroy reached its climax in 1968. The Americans had the capacity to basically probe every area of Saigon, of Vietnam and beyond, and engage the enemy. And engage the enemy they did, with both big and small scale search and destroy operations. And they had over 500,000 troops. Well, the Americans, in terms of their losses, in this year, they lost 150,000 wounded and 14,000 Americans killed in this single year, 1968. And remember, they had slightly over 500,000. So a casualty rate of over 160,000 out of a complement of over 500,000, you're over 20%. You're getting close to 25%. That's a very high casualty rate. So the war was brutal and intense during this war, and it was in this context then that we see the My Lai massacre. My Lai here in the province of Quang Nay. There was American troops massacred 400 peasants in a village, My Lai, in the province of Quang Nay, which is located here, right here, in Annam. See, the DMZ is up here. This is further to the south. Saigon is further down here. Somewhere between the DMZ and the city of Saigon is Quang Nay, and along the coast there was a village, My Lai, and it was destroyed. And 400 of the villagers were gunned down by U.S. soldiers of the so-called American Division, the American Division. And a military historian describes the American Division at this time in the following way. He says, the American Division suffered from grave command and control problems stemming from poor training and a lack of leadership, from division down to platoon level, which permitted civilian mistreatment. Some elements of its 2nd Infantry Brigade were little better than organized bands of thugs, with the officers eager participants in the body count game. eager participants in the body count campaign. In other words, killing civilians. The officers were participating in this. Now, what was the body count campaign game? And we should mention this because it is related to McNamara's quantification of the war. One of the measures of progress in this war, according to the computer system that, of course, was comprehensive in the American military, was how many casualties you inflicted on the enemy. And so, these were abstract numbers. And so in the field, soldiers, especially officers, got credit for the number of casualties they inflicted on the enemy. So who could tell who the enemy is? And so there was a tendency basically to kill civilians and sort of boost your numbers. The key thing was body counts, how many bodies? And so a lot of people got killed in this way. Now, we don't know how many people, we know about My Lai because after this event, it was so horrible that some of the GIs who were part of the American division, when they got out of the army, they went to the press, they went to the media, and they told the story. But the army itself tried to cover it all up. But the publicity became so intense that an official inquiry was launched, and ultimately the inquiry found that 30 men, including some officers, were guilty, and they were punished, even with prison term. But later on, when Nixon took power, they were let off. They were pardoned. They never ultimately served their sentences because Nixon let them off. Well, My Lai, I mean, the real question is how many My Lais were there? And there were many GIs, ex-GIs, who, in the aftermath of the publicity around My Lai, said, well, I wasn't at My Lai, but I was at this place and I was that place, and the same thing happened. And to this day, we don't really know how many massacres there were. And they tended to happen because, as I said, the body count thing was quite important. There was also a lot of frustration on the part of these troops because, as I've explained, the structure of the National Liberation Front was based on the villages, and many villages were actually Viet Cong, National Liberation Front, or supported to the National Liberation. So they would be guerrillas by night and civilians during the day. And who could tell? Who was the enemy? There was a lot of frustration about this. And also fear, because these GIs are patrolling and they see these peasants maybe working in the fields and so on, but maybe they're Viet Cong and so on. There was a lot of fear. Also, there was racial prejudice, undoubtedly. The United States, of course, the main brunt of racism in the United States are the Blacks. But historically, of course, there's been a lot of racism against Chicanos and Chinese, East Asians. And there is that, of course, even today. That's true, of course, in Canada as well. And already this word, actually, it seems to date back, it has a long date, maybe yes, it was the war of conquest that the Americans conducted in the Philippines at the beginning of the 20th century. You remember that the Spanish-American War. Well, the Americans basically moved in to the Philippines, and the Filipinos actually resisted. Uh, the Filipinos don't like to talk about this very much. In Winnipeg, when I started asking about this and so on, they sort of changed the subject. But an actual guerrilla resistance developed on the part of the Filipinos. And it took the Americans 10, 12 years to actually conquer the Philippines. And they killed a lot of people in the Philippines. How many people we don't know. Some say as many as perhaps 300,000 Filipinos perished when the Americans took over. Well, during that war, they began to refer to the resistance as gooks, the word gooks, Gooks. And the same term was applied to the North, to the Koreans during these Asians, the gooks. And likewise, in Vietnam, the term gook was used as well. It was, racism becomes a kind of a way you can explain reality without thinking too much about really what's going on. Somebody is responsible. Well, in any case, let me find my place. Now, the Americans, in terms of the continuing fighting, one of the things, a major problem was the fact that the Tet Offensive had basically destroyed pacification. The NLF was in control of the countryside as a result of Tet. And so to recover the countryside, recover control of the countryside, the Americans launched what they called Operation Phoenix. Operation Phoenix. Now, the Americans, as I said, everything was quantified, all aspects of this situation, including the Americans, with the help of the Saigon police and the military, Saigon military intelligence, kept computerized dossiers on millions of South Vietnamese. And they had accumulated files of hundreds of thousands of people who, one way or another, came under suspicion. So a campaign of arrest, intimidation, torture, and even execution was instituted, known as Operation Phoenix, as a way of bringing the countryside under control. And it's believed that over 100,000 South Vietnamese were basically executed during Operation Phoenix. And it seemed to work in part, in the sense that, of course, they didn't destroy the infrastructure, but they certainly did a lot of damage with Operation Phoenix. At the same time, they were bombing of the South, of course, of the North. Well, the area around Hanoi was spared, but as you went south towards the DMC in the north, there was intense bombing that continued, and over the south, the bombing reached horrendous levels in the south. Meanwhile, the Americans began Vietnamization. They began to modernize even more and expand the South Vietnamese army with the intent that they would take on the combat operations as the Americans withdrew. So by the end of, by 1969, they had about 850,000 ARVN troops paid for by the Americans. And ultimately, before it was all over, 1.2 million ARVN. But really, these troops, except for certain elite units, there were a few divisions which could fight well. But for the most part, the ARVN was incompetent and corrupt, would not engage the enemy, and so on. Well, meanwhile, let's look at the overall political situation. And there we see that, as I said, suggested earlier, 68 was the crest. It was the crest of the internal upheaval within the United States. But also, you have to understand this, and it's important. Uh, this was worldwide. The upheaval caused by the Vietnam War led to social upheaval in virtually every country of the world, including, of course, the United Kingdom, um, Germany, especially France and Italy, where there were near revolutions. In these two countries, France and Italy, there were near revolutions. France, the workers, well, France and Italy, they took over the factories in both those two countries. It was a near thing, and I would say, if anywhere, it was in those two countries that the possibility of revolution was real. And so far as Canada went, um, in Canada, there were ongoing and rolling anti-war protests everywhere. It just became part of the culture, along with all kinds of other protests developed in Canada. Let's see, the book, I think I listed it, Brian Palmer, Canada in the 60s. A superb book. And it shows that Canada had its own, it's not all about the United States. Canada had incredibly an interesting history during the 60s. The birth of the women's movement, the indigenous movement that we're living with today was born in the 1960s. And of course, French Canadian nationalism was extremely intense. And all of this is explored in this book by Brian Palmer. In the United States, of course, there was ongoing tension between the Hawks and the Doves, between whites and blacks, between the young and the old. It's a generational conflict. And even from a cultural point of view, between the hippies and the straight people. This was the period of the counterculture. Groovy stuff. All of that happened in the middle of all this. But I would say the anti-war movement, even people who weren't aware of it, the upheaval, the root of it was the Black Revolt and the conflict in Vietnam was what's stirring things up. But it reflected itself in a cultural war, what I'm saying. And I mentioned the hippies and the straight people who like the big bands of the past. It's against Bob Dylan and the Beatles and so on. You're familiar with all this. A major event was the assassination of Martin Luther King in following his brother's assassination in 63. Now, on April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Tennessee. And this immediately set off the major wave of Black revolt. There had been, every summer, there had been big riots and burnings since 1965, but this was the peak. 130 cities experienced major riots. There were maybe 50 people died, thousands were injured in these riots. Washington, D.C., which had a very large Black population, was absolutely out of control, and the army had to be called in. Martial law was declared in Washington. And of course, the universities were in a state of complete agitation. The military were encamped in the universities. They had what was called the Reserve Officers Training Corps. The military recruited people as officers from the universities. Well, the students drove the ROTC off the campus. They just attacked the offices of the ROTC, and they had to withdraw from the college campuses. Any military recruiter who came on the campus to try to get people to join the Marines, for example, or any other branch, was attacked by the students. And the students attacked military research grants by the military, by the Pentagon. Well, grants by the Pentagon were enormous. A huge part of the research in American universities, not even to speak about Canadian research, was basically funded by the military. And the administrators said, well, this research is useful. And the students would say, yes, useful for war. And they would finger the professors who were involved in this or corner the administrators. They were terrified, promising never to do it again. And of course, this even happened at the U of M. Might as well tell you the story. The psychology department, the head of the psychology department, Zubek, John Zubek, he was the head of the psychology department. And that building, the psychology building, is named after him. And this guy, he had huge grants from, it wasn't the American military, it was the Canadian and the British military. And what was his research? Sensory deprivation. He was a pioneer in sensory deprivation research. Well, what is this all about? Well, you put the person in a room, you deprive him of light and hearing and so on, and over time, the person becomes completely befuddled and is basically driven crazy as a result of this sensory deprivation. That's what Zubik did. And he made his academic reputation on this. And it was applied, particularly known was the way the British were using this against the Irish Republicans in Ireland. There was an insurgency in Ireland. And all of this became known. And Zubek, who was extremely prestigious, and he said in an interview that he spent 6 days at work, and the other day was devoted to his investments. The other day was devoted to his investment. Well, as a result of being humiliated, he jumped into the Red River and drowned himself. That was the end of Zubek. And so that's why today, if you apply for a grant, you have to fill out a form talking about sort of the human impact. I don't know whether you've had any experience of this. Maybe you will. If you apply for a university grant and so on, there's this human impact thing that they devised in response to the clamor, to the scandal. But this was just one place. Now, in terms of university unrest, the incident that attracted the most attention was at Columbia University, of course, which is a great and big university in the center of Manhattan, one of the most prestigious schools in the United States. And they were conducting military research, but also it's a bit of a crazy place, Columbia, because it sits right next to Harlem, which is the center, was the center of the big black ghetto in the heart of New York City. Millions of black people in there and suffering. And so Columbia announces, first of all, the students begin to denounce the military research, and then the Columbia announces that they're going to build a big gym, and they're going to expropriate some of the land in Harlem in order to build this gym. Well, the students, there were many radical students, and the black militants, the black power people, got together and they seized university buildings. 3 or 4 university buildings were seized by the students. And the university brought in the New York Police Department. And there were pitched battles in the middle of New York City, and a lot of nasty, nobody died, but there was, the university had to cancel, there was a general strike of the students, and the university basically had to cancel the academic year as a result of the disorder. Well, we could cite other campuses, San Francisco State and so on. There was huge unrest among the Black and the Asian students and so on. But this was, as I say, ubiquitous. And even the students resorted to burning down university buildings and bombings. There were about 40 bombings of university buildings during this period. Now, this was part of the situation. The next thing I'm going to talk about are the US elections. You can imagine in the middle of all this, elections, in the wake of Johnson's resignation, there is a presidential election, and we'll begin next session discussing that. Have a great weekend.